My daughter said, "You're no good." And in that instant, my world seemed to shrink. I sat silently in the living room armchair, observing her cold gaze and the satisfied expression on my son-in-law's face. He thought he had won, that he had put me in my place, but I didn't react. I just watched. I've learned over the years that silence, when used wisely, can be more powerful than any word spoken in anger. The day had begun like any other. I, a retired woman, lived alone in my small apartment, surrounded by memories of a lifetime. My daughter, ambitious and practical, rarely cared about my feelings. I always hoped she would respect me, but the reality was different. For her, love and care had an expiration date, and I had already passed my expiration date. My son-in-law, controlling and arrogant, was always ready to reinforce this feeling of worthlessness. As I entered the room, my daughter seemed determined. Her footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, and every gesture conveyed contempt. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I remained seated firm, as if my body were an anchor against the approaching emotional storm. She came closer, looked me in the eyes, and uttered that phrase as if it were natural, almost casual. "You're no good." It was as if I had received an invisible slap. I could have responded, I could have cried, but something inside me told me that the answer would be silent, that my attentive gaze would say more than any words. My son-in-law, sitting beside her, smiled triumphantly. That expression reminded me of a judge who thinks he has already pronounced the final sentence. He believed that this moment was his victory, that my place had been definitively decided. I, however, felt a mixture of sadness and determination. The pain of rejection was intense, but there was something deeper. The realization that my life would not end with that cold judgment. I still had my story, my dignity, and above all the capacity to resist. While they talked about plans and matters that didn't include me, my mind wandered to memories of the past. I remembered when my daughter was a child, her first words, her laughter, and her tight hugs. How many nights I spent awake caring for her, keeping her fever down, wiping away her tears, and encouraging her dreams. Every gesture of affection now seemed transformed into an emotional debt she would never acknowledge. Life, I thought, has strange ways of teaching us difficult lessons, and this was one of them. My son-in-law, always ready to assert his authority, began to talk about responsibilities and expectations, as if my presence were a burden to be carried. He pointed out every detail of how I failed to meet his standards and the vision they had for the family. I listened attentively, absorbing every word. It wasn't a time to argue back. It was a time to understand, to analyze, to learn their weaknesses so that, in the future, I could use them strategically. My patience, contrary to what they seemed to believe, was not weakness. As they spoke, I noticed subtle signs of arrogance and insecurity, details that only a close observer can perceive. The son-in-law gestured excessively, trying to convince himself that he was right, while my daughter alternated between looks of superiority and quick, almost mechanical smiles. Each of their gestures taught me something about who they were and how to handle the situation. I might not have had power over them at that moment, but I had something they would never understand: control over my own emotions and my next actions. Silence became my shield. Every spoken phrase, every gesture of contempt, only reinforced my decision not to succumb to humiliation. I could feel the tension in the air, but instead of bending, I focused on observing. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with alertness. I was learning to transform pain into strength, contempt into knowledge. Life had taught me, through years of hardship and loss, that patience and observation are often more powerful than immediate reaction. When they finally got up to leave, my son-in-law still sported that satisfied smile, convinced he had defeated me. My daughter followed behind him, indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed inside me. That silence, that moment of pain, had awakened an ancient, almost forgotten strength. I would no longer be just the despised mother. I was beginning to become observant, strategic, and above all, determined. Locked in my armchair, after the door slammed shut behind them, I realized something essential had happened. My dignity was still intact, my patience was still mine, and the faith I had always carried remained alive. I knew, silently, that justice, one way or another, would still prevail. Every word they spoke, every arrogant gesture, had planted a seed of determination within me. I promised myself that I would no longer allow myself to be defined as useless. My time to act would come, and I would be ready. That day, I understood that silence is not the absence of action. It is preparation. It is contained strength. I didn't need to prove anything in the heat of the moment. Observing and absorbing every detail, every intention, every gesture, would give me an advantage they could never imagine. My son-in-law might believe he won. My daughter might think she diminished me, but I knew the truth. That story wasn't written yet. And when the time came, my actions would speak louder than any insult. As the afternoon sun illuminated my small apartment, I felt a spark of hope. I still had my life, my past of love and dedication, and the ability to rebuild my present with dignity. The daughter's contempt and the son-in-law's arrogance could not erase what I knew about myself. That my worth did not depend on their approval, but on my courage to move forward, my patience to wait, and my determination to overcome the injustice imposed upon me. And so, I sat in my armchair, breathing deeply, feeling each beat of my heart as a silent reminder that my story was not yet over. I would observe, learn, and when the time was right, act. Because despite the contempt, humiliation, and arrogance I faced that day, I still owned my dignity, and no one could take that away from me. The next day dawned gray, as if the sky had captured the sadness I felt the previous afternoon. I could still hear my daughter's words echoing in my mind. "You're no good." It was like a deep cut, renewed with each memory. Despite everything, I tried to maintain my routine, take care of the house, and organize my things. But the memory of my son-in-law's gaze, his arrogant smile, and the certainty of his victory wouldn't leave me in peace. While preparing my breakfast, I tried to understand where everything had started to fall apart. For years, I dedicated myself to my family, thinking that love and care were enough. But I realized, with bitterness, that for them, ambition and control would always take priority. My every gesture, every word, was evaluated and criticized, and any slip-up became a reason for humiliation. The silence I maintained yesterday hadn't been enough to change their attitudes, but at least it gave me the clarity that I needed to observe, plan, and understand their every move. On the phone, my daughter called me in a cold, direct tone, asking me to help her with some chores around her house. The request seemed innocent, but I knew it was a trap. The intention was always to put me in uncomfortable situations, reinforcing the idea that I was worthless. I took a deep breath and accepted, not out of submission, but as an opportunity to observe, to notice details that could be useful in the future. Every step I took in that environment controlled by them was a silent lesson in human behavior. Upon arriving at the house, I was greeted with the superficial cordiality they always displayed. My daughter gave me a quick, almost imperceptible glance, as if gauging my reaction. My son-in-law, sitting in the living room, stared at me with that smile of someone who believes they are in control of the situation. Every gesture of his was calculated, as if he were testing my limits. I felt the weight of humiliation again, but I held back my emotions. I knew that any show of weakness would be used against me. While helping organize the kitchen, my daughter started talking about projects, money, and family events, as if I were invisible. My son-in-law interrupted from time to time, making subtle comments that reinforced my inferior position. It was painful to listen, but I tried to transform the pain into analysis, observing patterns, identifying weaknesses, and understanding the dynamics between them. The silence I maintained was strategic, a way to preserve my dignity even when everything around me seemed overwhelming. At one point, my daughter mentioned something that deeply affected me: plans to sell my childhood home, which I still held dear in my memories. The idea of losing those spaces, which held my history and my identity, made me tremble inside. My son-in-law, noticing my reaction, smiled contentedly, convinced he had hurt me. I took a deep breath, holding back tears, but deep down I felt a growing determination. If they believed they could destroy my past and my worth, they were about to discover that I still had the strength to resist. As we finished organizing the kitchen, my daughter began listing tasks I had to complete that day, some simple, others clearly designed to wear me down. Each command came with a veiled criticism, a subtle hint. My son-in-law added calculated observations, always reinforcing the idea that I was incapable. But instead of feeling diminished, I felt something grow inside me, the awareness that my dignity was intact, even if they didn't recognize it. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A neighbor, who had always looked at me with affection and respect, appeared to deliver some packages that had arrived addressed to me. He smiled and casually commented on how generous and helpful I had always been to everyone around me. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief and validation. Someone still recognized my worth. My son-in-law, noticing the interaction, frowned, clearly bothered by the presence of someone who didn't accept his authority. My daughter, on the other hand, maintained an evasive gaze, as if trying to ignore any sign of recognition from outside the family. My neighbor invited me to chat for a moment out of their sight. We went out into the garden, and he told me little stories about how the people in the neighborhood always remembered me fondly. It was a simple moment, but it brought me comfort. There were still people who recognized my kindness and dedication. As we talked, I felt a silent determination forming within me. I wasn't alone, even though my own daughter and son-in-law tried to convince me otherwise. Life's justice doesn't depend on immediate approval. It reveals itself in due time. When we went back inside, I noticed that my daughter and son-in-law were more attentive, almost suspicious of my momentary absence. They didn't understand that, while I seemed merely obedient and silent, my mind was active, registering every detail, analyzing every gesture, every expression. I could feel the tension in the air, and it reminded me that they still believed they were in control. But with each passing moment, I realized that this illusion was temporary. The day progressed, and my patience, combined with observation, became my greatest strength. At the end of the day, my daughter asked me to help pack some boxes in the attic. I climbed carefully, carrying mementos from years past. Each object was a reminder of love, care, and sacrifice. My son-in-law was right behind me, supervising and offering subtle criticism, while my daughter spoke sharply about my supposed inability. It was there, among dusty boxes and old memories, that I felt the most intense pain. It wasn't just their disdain. It was the awareness that, for years, my dedication had been ignored and diminished. But in that silent attic, something happened. While organizing the boxes, my eyes fell upon an old photo album. I saw my daughter as a child, smiling with joy, and my heart filled with a mixture of longing and strength. In that instant, I realized that all the humiliation and contempt could not erase the love I had given, nor the life I had lived. It was there, in that moment of introspection, that the first seed of true resistance began to sprout within me. As I descended the stairs, carrying some boxes, I felt that something had changed. The pain was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. I had observed, learned, and begun to understand their dynamics more clearly. My silence ceased to be merely a defense. It became a preparation, a silent strategy to deal with injustice and, when the time was right, to act with strength and dignity. And as I left their house that late afternoon, I noticed the satisfied smile of my son-in-law, still convinced that he had won. But inside me, something had changed. I was no longer just the silent victim. I was becoming someone capable of resisting, of observing, and one day, transforming that humiliation into learning and justice. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, I felt I could walk with confidence, even surrounded by the contempt of my own family. In the days that followed, I realized that my daughter's disdain and my son-in-law's arrogance were not just isolated moments, but deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. Each visit to their home became an exercise in patience and observation, and I began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Small comments, subtle gestures, and judgmental glances were like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a reality I had been reluctant to accept. My presence was considered a constant nuisance. One afternoon, I was asked to help organize financial documents, a task my daughter knew would make me uncomfortable. Upon opening a drawer, I noticed that some old papers related to my retirement had been moved in a way that made them difficult for me to access. My son-in-law, observing my every move, commented with an ironic smile. "I think you'll need more attention to deal with these things, Mom." The intention was clear: to demonstrate that I was incapable, to reinforce the idea that I was good for nothing. As he spoke, I felt that mixture of pain and indignation again, but I took a deep breath. I had learned that when faced with people who feed off our humiliation, the best response is to remain calm and analyze the situation. Each of their gestures, each comment, revealed more about their personality than about my worth. I realized that, for them, power and control were more important than respect and love. But observation gave me strength. I didn't need to prove anything in the heat of the moment. My time would come. On another occasion, my daughter brought up a sensitive subject: the division of our family's inheritance. She spoke bluntly, as if coldly calculating numbers, completely ignoring the feelings involved. "There's no point in keeping old things you don't even use," she said, while my son-in-law nodded with that satisfied smile. I felt the impact of every word, not only because of the injustice, but because of the contempt that overflowed from every gesture. It was as if my entire life had been reduced to that: useless, irrelevant, and disposable. However, instead of becoming discouraged, I began to reflect. Each of their gestures revealed vulnerabilities: the need for control, insecurity disguised as arrogance. I started to observe not only their actions towards me, but also how they interacted with each other. I realized that my daughter, despite being ambitious, often hesitated before important decisions, and my son-in-law, however controlling he might be, showed signs of impatience when he couldn't impose his will. These details were small, but valuable. They showed that their power was not absolute. On one of those visits, during a tense lunch, my son-in-law decided to test my patience even more directly. He began listing my supposed flaws, comparing me to other family members who, according to him, were more efficient and useful. Each sentence was laden with sarcasm, and my daughter, silent, seemed to support each word with subtle glances. I felt the sting of humiliation again, but something inside me reacted differently. Instead of fear, I felt a profound clarity. I was not responsible for their choices, nor for the wounded ego they carried. While tidying up the dishes after lunch, I heard my son-in-law mutter something about putting everything in its place. I knew exactly what he meant: to reaffirm the idea that I had no place in that environment, that my opinion was irrelevant. But instead of letting anger or sadness overwhelm me, I took a deep breath and let my actions speak for themselves. My patience became my shield, and observation my weapon. I was learning that silent resistance can be more powerful than direct confrontation. That afternoon, I had the opportunity to speak with my daughter alone when she called me to help her organize some old files. She was impatient, and her tone indicated that any hesitation on my part would be met with criticism. But in the silence of the room, I managed to perceive signs that gave me hope. There were moments when she hesitated, quick glances that betrayed doubts or insecurities, small hints of humanity that made me believe that, even amidst arrogance and contempt, there was still room for reflection and change. While organizing the files, I discovered something that shocked me: old documents revealing financial mistakes made by my son-in-law, which he had tried to hide. My heart raced, and I realized that this discovery could be a key to changing the power dynamic. I needed to act cautiously. Revealing it immediately could generate conflict, but keeping the information without planning my next step would also be risky. It was yet another reminder that patience and strategy were essential. At the end of the day, when the tension seemed to ease, my son-in-law suggested I go home. "You must be tired," he said with a smile that tried to disguise his satisfaction. My daughter, silent, simply nodded. As I said goodbye, I felt the weight of humiliation, but also a silent determination growing within me. I had observed, learned, and begun to understand the fragility of their power. That day showed that, even amidst injustice and contempt, there were loopholes that could be exploited with patience and intelligence. When I got home, I sat in the armchair and took a deep breath. The pain of humiliation was still there, but something was different. A sense of clarity, of awareness of my own worth and of the vulnerabilities of those who despised me. I realized that I couldn't change their attitudes overnight, but I could prepare the ground for future moments where my dignity and emotional justice would prevail. Every detail observed, every gesture recorded in my memory, would be useful later on. And it was in that reflective silence that I perceived the first seed of true resistance blossoming within me. I was no longer merely reacting to the humiliation. I was analyzing, learning, and planning. I knew the road would be long and that the daughters and son-in-law's contempt wouldn't end easily, but I also understood that life's justice often arrives in unexpected ways. And for the first time, I felt a spark of hope. My time to act would still come, and when it did, I would be ready to transform every moment of pain into strength and overcoming. That night, before falling asleep, while reflecting on the day's events, I felt that something was about to change. The growing tension, the injustices revealed, and the small discoveries showed me that nothing was as absolute as it seemed. And in that instant, I silently vowed to myself, no matter how much they tried to humiliate or diminish me, I would resist, I would learn, and when the time was right, my story would be rewritten with dignity, courage, and justice. The following morning, I felt a mixture of expectation and apprehension. Although the previous days had been difficult, there was something inside me that refused to succumb to discouragement. The silence and constant observation had given me a clarity I hadn't possessed before. I already understood the vulnerabilities of my daughter and son-in-law, and something inside me told me that this would be a different day, a day when the tide would begin to turn. I received an unexpected call from a lawyer I barely knew, someone recommended by a neighbor concerned about my family situation. His voice was firm but cordial, and he informed me that he had discovered old documents mentioning assets that, until then, I believed didn't exist. My heart raced. Could it be true? For years, I thought everything I owned had been ignored or taken indirectly, but now a real opportunity to change my situation had arisen. I took a deep breath and agreed to meet him at his office. The journey there was filled with memories. Streets I'd known since my youth, house facades that held memories, and the cold morning wind that seemed to blow along with my determination. Upon arriving, I was greeted with courtesy and understanding. The lawyer showed me old papers, contracts, and property records that were, in fact, in my name or legally in my name. It was a shock but also a feeling of relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt that control might be changing hands. As we reviewed the documents, he explained in detail what each paper meant. Small properties, forgotten valuables, old bank accounts, and inheritances I never suspected. Each line I read was a confirmation that despite years of neglect, the arrogance of my son-in-law, and the coldness of my daughter, I still had resources, dignity, and legitimate power. I felt silent tears stream down my face, not of sadness, but of an intense emotion that mixed relief, surprise, and determination. Leaving the office, I began mentally planning how I would use that discovery. I knew it wouldn't be simple. My daughter and son-in-law would certainly try to contest, minimize, or manipulate any situation that threatened the control they felt they possessed. But this time I felt different. I was no longer just the humiliated mother. I was armed with knowledge and legal authority, and that gave me unprecedented strength. Every step I took now would be calculated, strategic, and silently powerful. Upon arriving home, I decided not to reveal anything immediately. I needed to process the information, plan my next actions, and understand the right moment to act. My son-in-law remained convinced of his supremacy, and my daughter, indifferent, believed I remained vulnerable and dependent. But at that moment, I realized that everything was about to change. Every gesture that had previously seemed intimidating now became just an opportunity for me to observe, learn, and strengthen myself. Late in the afternoon, my daughter called me again to go to her house, and I accepted, maintaining the calm that had become my ally. Arriving there, I found her son-in-law impatient as always. But this time, something in me had changed. I wasn't just the silent victim. My posture, my gaze, and my presence conveyed a new, albeit restrained, confidence. The son-in-law noticed the difference but tried to hide his surprise, while my daughter continued acting naturally, oblivious to the transformation that was beginning. During lunch, I tried to observe every detail. The son-in-law's gestures, the daughter's tone, even the rhythm of the conversation. Something inside me indicated that I could use that moment to my advantage. While they discussed trivial matters, I remembered the properties and inheritances I had recently discovered. I knew that my knowledge could not yet be revealed, But just being aware of the possibilities already strengthened me. For the first time, I felt I could confront their arrogance without feeling fear or humiliation. After lunch, my daughter asked me to help reorganize old documents in the study. As I climbed the stairs with some files, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. It was as if the universe was conspiring in my favor. Among dusty papers, I found old letters, receipts, and records that, though ignored for years, were now clues to a power that was about to be reclaimed. Each document I touched seemed to whisper that justice was somehow still on my side. In the attic, while organizing boxes, I found an old contract for a property my parents had bought years ago. My son-in-law, noticing my discovery, tried to intervene, cynically asking if I knew what I was doing. I just smiled discreetly, maintaining my silence. He had no idea that his every move was being recorded in my memory, and that, sooner or later, I would have the knowledge and proof to change the dynamics of our relationship. As I went downstairs with the boxes, I felt for the first time a sense of control that had previously seemed impossible. I was still surrounded by contempt, but the discovery of the documents gave me something they could never take away: awareness of my worth, legal rights, and concrete possibilities for transformation. My son-in-law might believe he had won, my daughter might act arrogantly, but now there was a fundamental difference. I was no longer at their mercy. When I finally said goodbye, I realized that the tension that always hung in the air had changed. My son-in-law still tried to maintain his imposing posture, but there was uncertainty in his gestures. My daughter, indifferent, seemed unable to perceive the silent transformation that was taking place. I, on the other hand, felt a new strength, a silent but powerful determination that would make me act with wisdom and firmness when the time was right. That day, as I walked home, I realized something essential had happened. The discovery of the old documents not only revealed forgotten resources, but also awakened in me an unprecedented courage. I would no longer be the humiliated woman, the silent victim. Now there was hope, strategy, and strength to transform pain into justice, contempt into learning, and silence into action. The tide was beginning to turn, and my time was coming. And that night, as I sat in my armchair, I took a deep breath and smiled silently. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could face my daughter and son-in-law as equals, not with aggression, but with awareness, dignity, and knowledge. Something within me had awakened. The certainty that life, despite injustices, still offered opportunities for redemption and overcoming. The road ahead would be long, but I was ready to walk it with courage, even surrounded by the contempt of my own family. The days that followed were difficult. The discovery of the old documents gave me hope, but it didn't erase the cruel reality I faced daily. My daughter remained cold and distant, my son-in-law arrogant and controlling, and every interaction with them became a test of patience and endurance. I felt the humiliation intensify, as if they had noticed a change in me and wanted to further reinforce their dominance. That day, my daughter called me to help her organize an old cabinet in the living room. Upon arriving, I immediately noticed the tension in my son-in-law's eyes. He was aware that something about me had changed, although he didn't know exactly what. During the task, my daughter began to list my flaws directly, comparing me to other family members and pointing out details from my past that, according to her, proved my inadequacy. Each word was like a blade piercing my chest, but I remained silent. My son-in-law, sitting in a nearby chair, added sarcastic comments, always reinforcing the idea that I was worthless. He observed my efforts, criticized my way of organizing things, and asked intentionally complicated questions, just to show that I was slow or distracted. I felt the sting of humiliation growing, mixed with a silent anger burning inside me. But I knew that any explosive reaction would be used against me, so I remained silent, breathing deeply and focusing only on the tasks ahead. While organizing dusty boxes, I found old photos of my daughter as a child. The contrast between that innocent smile and the cold, calculating look she now possessed broke my heart. I thought of all the nights I spent caring for her, all the sacrifices I made, and how every gesture of love had been ignored or misinterpreted. The pain of injustice seemed overwhelming, but at the same time, it began to transform into something new: silent determination. My daughter began recounting details of a family project that completely excluded my participation, making comments that made it clear they saw me as dispensable. "I don't know why you still bother with these old things," she said, with a superior smile. Her son-in-law, reinforcing this, added, "She's just a hindrance, isn't she?" I felt the weight of those words as if they were stones on my chest, but I maintained my composure. The pain was intense, but I didn't allow my dignity to be broken. As I continued organizing, I noticed that some boxes had been moved intentionally to confuse me, creating small obstacles that made my work more difficult. It was clear that my daughter and son-in-law were reveling in my difficulty, and this caused me a mixture of anger and sadness. But despite the humiliation, I observed every detail. Each of their gestures, each comment, was a learning opportunity. I began to notice patterns. The way they manipulated the environment and situations to weaken me. In the middle of the task, a small accident occurred. A heavy box fell, scattering papers and objects across the floor. My daughter let out an impatient cry and accused me of being clumsy. My son-in-law, with a sarcastic smile, said, "And you still think you're capable?" The humiliation at that moment was almost unbearable. I felt tears threatening to fall, but I held them back. Instead, I took a deep breath, remaining calm and carefully picking up each object. Each gesture of patience and self-control was a small victory over the abuse that was being inflicted. After the incident, my daughter pulled me away from the room and began speaking to me in a condescending tone, listing my mistakes and failings in an almost ritualistic way. I listened, feeling the physical pain of contempt, but something had changed within me. The humiliation no longer broke me, it only strengthened my resolve. I began to realize that pain could be transformed into strength, that each criticism, each look of contempt, was fuel for my own self-improvement. While she spoke, my son-in-law remained silent, observing, as if measuring the impact of her words. It was at that moment that I realized an essential truth. They believed they controlled me, but in reality, they had no idea what was happening inside me. Every humiliating word, every arrogant gesture, was being recorded in my memory like a map. I was learning, strengthening myself, and preparing the way to change my own story. When they finally left me alone, I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the scattered boxes and papers. The pain of humiliation was still present, but something new began to grow. The awareness that my life and my worth did not depend on their approval. For the first time in a long time, I felt a silent force forming within me. I could feel the tide beginning to turn, albeit slowly, and that the justice I had awaited for so long was drawing near. That day, before going to sleep, I reflected on every detail. The daughter's contempt, the son-in-law's arrogance, the small obstacles placed to destabilize me. All of this showed me that I needed patience, strategy, and courage. The humiliation I felt would not bring me down. On the contrary, it would be the foundation of my resistance. I knew that, although they believed they had won, something was silently changing within me. The certainty that my story would still be written with dignity, courage, and justice. And so, that night, I realized that the pain I felt wasn't just suffering, it was fuel. Every cruel word, every gesture of contempt, was a reminder of what I needed to overcome and a motivation to no longer be defined by others. For the first time, I felt that the strength I had cultivated for years was ready to emerge, and that every humiliation faced would transform into learning, preparation, and strategy for my own victory. The next morning, I woke up with a different feeling. Something inside me was beginning to change. A weight that had once seemed unbearable was now transforming into silent strength. The days of humiliation and contempt hadn't disappeared, but something told me I was no longer just the victim. I was beginning to recognize myself as someone capable of overcoming, of rising up and rebuilding my own story. As I made my coffee, I thought about the past few weeks. Every gesture from my daughter, every comment from my son-in-law, every humiliating situation I faced, now seemed less overwhelming. I began to realize that, although they tried to control my life, I had something they could never take away. My conscience, my dignity, and my silent faith. I took a deep breath, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I decided that day would be dedicated to myself. I sat by the window, looking at the blooming garden outside, and closed my eyes for a few minutes. I silently prayed for strength, courage, and clarity. I have always had faith, even in the most difficult moments, and now it seemed to envelop me like an invisible shield. The silent prayer brought me comfort and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, I felt that justice and overcoming challenges were not just distant hopes, but concrete paths I could follow. Throughout the morning, I began to mentally review each recent event. The discovery of the old documents, the injustices faced, the son-in-law's arrogance, the daughter's disdain, everything began to fit into a larger picture. I realized that each challenge faced had prepared me for this moment, strengthening my patience, my observation, and my determination. Each pain suffered now became a stepping stone to my own transformation. I decided to get back in touch with the lawyer who had presented me with the documents. I needed to better understand my options and plan strategies, but this time not out of fear or desperation, but rather out of awareness and purpose. Every detail I learned about my rights was a piece of the puzzle I was putting together. I was no longer the submissive and humiliated woman. Now I was learning to act with intelligence and firmness, certain that my time would come. As I walked to the lawyer's office, I felt a newfound energy. The morning sun warmed my face, seemingly symbolizing the light emerging after weeks of emotional darkness. Upon arrival, I was greeted with kindness and attention, and we began to review the documents more carefully. I discovered details that had gone unnoticed before, small forgotten properties, old investments, and bank records that could guarantee not only my independence, but also justice in the face of the arrogance and contempt I had been experiencing. Leaving the office, I sat on a park bench nearby. I looked at the sky and felt a quiet peace. For the first time, I felt that life still offered real opportunities for rebuilding, and that my decisions could transform not only my present but also my future. The faith that had always silently sustained me now became active, guiding me and strengthening my confidence. I knew that days of humiliation would still exist, but I also knew that there were greater forces working in my favor. Back home, I decided to dedicate some time to my emotional health. I sat down with an old notebook and began to write down everything I felt. The pain, the anger, the humiliation, but also the hope, faith, and determination that were growing within me. Writing became a ritual for cleansing my soul, a way to organize my thoughts and transform confused feelings into strategies and understanding. Each word written was a step towards my own emotional freedom and overcoming the contempt I had been facing. Late in the afternoon, while looking at old family photos, I realized something I had never noticed before. No matter how much my daughter and son-in-law had humiliated me, there was always a thread of hope and love that could not be extinguished. The memory of the moments I cared for her, the nights I spent awake because of her fever, the words of encouragement I gave her in her childhood, all of this now showed me that I possessed something that no one could take away. My past of love and dedication, which transformed into strength for the present. Later, I felt an intense urge to bring order to my own life. I started organizing my apartment, throwing away what I no longer needed, and making small changes that reflected my inner state. Each object placed in its place, each corner cleaned, symbolized a small personal victory. I was regaining control over my own space, and this feeling of autonomy reinforced the certainty that my inner transformation was underway. At the end of the day, I sat by the window again, watching the darkening sky. The transformation within me was clear. The pain and humiliation still existed, but now they fueled my determination. My silent faith, my strategic patience, and my newfound awareness gave me the strength to confront my son-in-law's arrogance and my daughter's contempt. For the first time, I felt that emotional justice, overcoming adversity, and independence were not just dreams, but achievable goals, attainable through courage, planning, and faith. And so, that night, as I closed my eyes to sleep, I felt a profound peace and an unprecedented confidence. I was no longer just the humiliated mother, the silent victim. I was becoming someone capable of transforming pain into learning, contempt into strength, and injustice into overcoming. Each day, each challenge, each arrogant gesture from them now served as preparation for my own victory. I knew my time would come, and that when it did, my life would finally be mine again, with dignity, courage, and justice. The day began seemingly ordinary, but I felt a strange tension in the air. Something was different, a premonition that told me something big was about to happen. The usual routine of humiliation and contempt seemed to be preparing the ground for a turning point. I still carried the pain of the previous weeks, but my inner transformation gave me the courage and clarity to face any situation that might arise. I received an unexpected call from a family acquaintance, someone who years ago had been close to my late husband. He asked me to meet him discreetly at a nearby cafe. At first, I hesitated. I knew my daughter and son-in-law might question my absence, but something told me that this meeting would be important. I took a deep breath and accepted, feeling a mixture of expectation and anxiety. When I arrived at the cafe, he was waiting for me, seated at a table away from me. His gaze held concern, but also determination. He handed me a folder of documents which, upon opening, revealed something I never imagined. Evidence of financial mismanagement and manipulation of family assets committed by my son-in-law. Among the papers were falsified contracts, forged receipts, and records that clearly showed how he had tried to appropriate properties and assets that legally belonged to me. My heart raced. As I leafed through the documents, I realized the magnitude of the revelation. For years, my daughter and son-in-law had underestimated, humiliated, and excluded me, believing I was incapable of understanding their actions. But now, with this evidence, the situation was about to change. The pain and humiliation I had felt over time took on a new meaning. I was not just a victim, but someone who had a chance to regain dignity and justice. The man who handed me the documents explained, in detail, how everything had been registered and how it could be used to legally claim my rights. He said I needed to act cautiously, but also firmly. It was the first time I felt that justice wasn't just a distant concept, but something tangible that I could achieve. For the first time, I realized that my patience and constant observation had been essential preparations for this moment. As I walked back home, I felt a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, hope, and a silent determination burning within me. I knew I needed to choose the right moment to act, to give my son-in-law and daughter no chance to protect themselves. Every step I took was now calculated, every movement thought out. I was no longer the submissive mother. I was a woman who possessed concrete proof of her dignity and rights. Arriving home, I found my daughter complaining about something trivial. She didn't know about the meeting, nor the discovery, and I remained calm. My son-in-law was nearby, as always, observing my every move, convinced he was still in control. But I noticed a small detail in his gaze, a doubt, almost imperceptible, that gave me the feeling that the tide was truly beginning to turn. They didn't know that I held in my hands the truth that could transform our relationship forever. While helping to organize some paperwork, my mind was focused on the documents I had received. I thought about how to use them strategically, ensuring that justice was achieved without generating unnecessary confrontation. For the first time, I felt I could confront their contempt and arrogance with real tools, not just patience and observation. The revelation brought not only hope, but power. A silent but immense power. That same day, I decided to speak with my daughter privately. She was alone in the room, and I took advantage of the moment to talk calmly and firmly. Without mentioning the documents yet, I began to question her attitudes, her choices, and the way she treated her family. To my surprise, I noticed hesitation in her voice. For the first time, she showed doubt about her son-in-law's conduct and about her own position. A small sign of vulnerability, which showed me that the change I hoped for could actually happen. As we spoke, I felt something within me grow even stronger. I didn't need to shout, confront, or humiliate to claim my space. My strength lay in the truth I possessed, the patience I had cultivated, and the dignity I had maintained intact despite all the humiliations. For the first time, I realized I could transform not only my own life but also my daughter's conscience, showing her that justice and respect are inevitable when one stands firm in their principles. Late in the afternoon, I decided to prepare everything for a careful course of action. I gathered the documents, organized every detail, and considered the best moment to act. Every gesture I made now had a purpose: to reclaim what belonged to me, to demand respect, and to restore my dignity. The shocking revelation not only changed my perception of family, but also strengthened my faith and my quiet determination. I was no longer just the humiliated mother. I was about to become the woman who would lead her own story of justice. As the day ended, I sat by the window, watching the darkening sky. A feeling of silent power grew within me, along with the certainty that emotional justice was about to be served. I could feel the tide turning, my son-in-law's arrogance weakening before the truth I now possessed. For the first time in a long time, I felt that my actions could transform pain into victory, humiliation into overcoming, and contempt into recognition. And that night, before going to sleep, I took a deep breath and silently gave thanks. For the first time, I felt that my life was no longer under the sway of arrogance and contempt. The shocking revelation had awakened a strength I didn't know I possessed, a quiet and strategic courage that would allow me to reclaim my dignity and rights. I knew the next steps would be challenging, but now I was ready. For the first time, I felt that my time for transformation and justice had arrived. The day dawned clear, with the sun streaming through the window and illuminating my small apartment in an almost symbolic way. For the first time in a long time, I felt that each ray of light reflected not only the beginning of the day, but also the silent strength growing within me. The shocking revelation about the old documents had awakened me, and now I knew that my transformation would not only be internal, but also concrete. I decided that day would be dedicated to preparing my plan of action. I sat at the table, surrounded by papers, contracts, and notes that I had carefully organized. The feeling of control was unprecedented. Every detail checked, every piece of information reviewed, made my heart beat faster, but also filled me with confidence. I was no longer at the mercy of my daughter's arrogance or my son-in-law's contempt. I had knowledge, strategy, and faith, and that was my new shield. As I worked, I recalled every humiliation I had faced. The pain was still there, but now it was fuel, not an overwhelming weight. Every gesture of contempt they had directed at me transformed into a lesson. The patience, observation, and resilience I had cultivated over time now became powerful tools for my own emotional liberation and justice. In the afternoon, I decided to visit one of the properties I had discovered in the old documents. It was a small house on a quiet street, forgotten by everyone, but legally registered in my name. Walking through the place was like entering a new chapter of my life. Every wall, every corner, seemed to whisper to me that justice still existed, that life could be rewritten, and that I had the right to claim my space. The feeling of belonging was almost tangible, and I felt a profound emotion. Finally, my worth was beginning to be recognized. While exploring the house, I noticed details that inspired me to imagine a different future. The garden, though neglected, had flowers sprouting among the stones, symbolizing that life always finds ways to renew itself. I felt a silent connection with that space, as if it represented not only a property, but also my own capacity for rebirth. With each step, my confidence grew, and the feeling of overcoming became more concrete. Upon returning home, I began planning small changes to my routine. I knew that transformation depended not only on reclaiming possessions, but also on rebuilding my own emotional life. I sorted through clothes, organized belongings, and prepared small daily rituals of empowerment. Reading, writing, prayer, and reflection. Each gesture symbolized my independence, my strength, and my determination to no longer be defined by the cruel actions of my daughter and son-in-law. During the afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from a longtime neighbor. She noticed my change, commenting on the different confidence I exuded. Her observation brought me quiet joy. For the first time, I realized that my inner transformation was already visible to others. The dignity I had silently cultivated was beginning to reflect in my actions and posture, reinforcing the idea that overcoming challenges is not just an internal feeling, but also an external presence that impacts those around us. Later, I decided to write a letter to my daughter. Not a letter of accusation or anger, but a letter of reflection and truth. I wanted her to subtly understand that the time of humiliation was over, and that I had regained my strength and dignity. Writing brought me clarity, and each carefully chosen phrase symbolized my transformation. I didn't need confrontations to demonstrate my strength. My own life, organized and conscious, would be the most powerful example. At the end of the day, I sat by the window again, watching the sky tinged orange by the sunset. The image was powerful, almost poetic. Each color in the sky seemed to reflect the intensity of the changes I was experiencing. For the first time, I felt that I had not only survived the humiliations, but that I was building something greater, a life of dignity, faith, and silent justice. I realized that every tear, every moment of pain, had prepared me for this path of overcoming. That night, reflecting on the day, I realized that the transformation wasn't just about recovering possessions or proving my worth to others. It was about rediscovering myself, recognizing my own strength, and learning to trust in the justice that life offers. My daughter's disdain and my son-in-law's arrogance were no longer shackles. Now they were memories of a past that had shaped me, but no longer defined my future. And as I closed my eyes to sleep, I felt an unprecedented peace. For the first time in a long time, I knew my life was in my own hands. The tide had turned, and I was finally in control of my own story. The pain of the past still existed, but it was a memory that strengthened my resolve, and the silent faith I cultivated gave me the courage to face any challenge that might still arise. The feeling of overcoming, dignity, and hope grew with each passing moment. I no longer needed my daughter's or son-in-law's approval. My inner strength, my knowledge, and my silent faith were enough. For the first time, I felt that the emotional justice and freedom I sought were within my reach. And at that moment, I realized that nothing could prevent me from building a life of respect, self-love, and fulfillment. The dawn of that day brought with it a calm I hadn't felt in years. I looked out the window and saw the sun gently illuminating the garden in front of the apartment. For the first time, I felt I wasn't just surviving. I was about to transform my life. The pain of the past was still present, but now it had transformed into clarity, courage, and determination. Every gesture, every thought, was now guided by a purpose: to reclaim my dignity and justice. While drinking my coffee, I mentally reviewed everything I had learned in the last few days. The discovery of the documents, the shocking revelation about my son-in-law's mismanagement, and the inner transformation I was feeling. It all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I was ready to act, but I knew patience would be essential. Emotional justice, I realized, isn't something that comes quickly. It arises at the right moment, when strategy and awareness walk hand in hand. I decided to start the day by organizing my house and apartment. Each object placed in its proper place, each corner cleaned and lit, symbolized the control I was regaining over my own life. It was as if each silent action conveyed a powerful message. I would no longer accept humiliation and contempt. My son-in-law and daughter, though oblivious, would somehow feel the change that was occurring within me. Later, I met with the lawyer again. This time, the goal was to devise a definitive strategy to ensure my rights were recognized and respected. Every contract, every receipt, and every document was carefully reviewed. He explained in detail how justice could be achieved, highlighting the steps that should be followed to make my position unquestionable. For the first time, I felt that everything was finally within my reach. During the meeting, I began to visualize the moment when I would confront my daughter and son-in-law with the truth. It wouldn't be an aggressive confrontation, but a clear demonstration that my discoveries and inner transformation could no longer be ignored. Each planned step conveyed firmness, patience, and emotional intelligence. I didn't need shouting or accusations. My strength lay in calmness and the certainty of my rights. Upon returning home, I decided to walk around the neighborhood, reflecting on the events. Each step seemed to reaffirm my resolve. I realized that I had regained control not only of external situations, but also of my feelings. The contempt that had previously crushed me was now merely fuel for my strategic action. For the first time, I felt that emotional justice did not depend on their actions, but rather on my ability to remain firm, aware, and determined. During the afternoon, I sat down with my notebook and wrote a detailed letter to my daughter. In it, I expressed my feelings, my pain, and also the transformation that had occurred within me. It wasn't an accusation, but a reflection. I wanted her to clearly understand that the family dynamic had changed, that my dignity was being reclaimed, and that I was prepared to be treated with respect. Each word written was a concrete step towards reconciliation, but also towards the justice I sought. After writing the letter, I decided to plan a visit to my daughter and son-in-law. Not out of anger, but with firmness. I would take the letter and some documentary evidence with me. In an organized and strategic way, I wanted them to realize that I was no longer vulnerable, that my actions would not be impulsive, and that my dignity could no longer be manipulated. For the first time, I felt I could enter that space with safety, confidence, and quiet authority. When I arrived at their house, their son-in-law was visibly surprised to see me with a firm posture and determined look. My daughter, still indifferent, greeted me with her usual air of superiority. I handed her the letter and calmly explained that she needed to read it carefully. There were no shouts, no accusations, only clarity, firmness, and sincerity. Their reaction was immediate: surprise, hesitation, and at times embarrassment. For the first time, they realized that I was no longer the submissive mother they thought they controlled. As my daughter read the letter, I felt an intense emotion. For the first time, there was a chance for genuine dialogue, for reflection on the past, and for acknowledging injustices. My son-in-law, though still arrogant, could not ignore the evidence I possessed. Each piece of documentary evidence, each carefully written word, and each firm gesture conveyed a powerful message. My time for justice had come. When I left that house, I felt an unprecedented peace. For the first time in a long time, I realized that I had not only reclaimed my dignity, but had also prepared the ground for a future reconciliation, based on respect, awareness, and justice. The tide had truly turned, and I was now walking confidently toward the conclusion of my story. That night, before going to sleep, I reflected on everything that had happened. Every moment of humiliation, every gesture of contempt, every pain endured over the years, had prepared me for this moment. For the first time, I felt that emotional justice was not just a wish, but a concrete reality that I was building with patience, strategy, and silent faith. And as I closed my eyes, I felt that my life was finally moving towards the redemption, the overcoming, and the justice I had sought for so long. The pain of the past was transforming into learning, and the silent strength I had cultivated was becoming visible and impactful. For the first time, I knew that my story would be written with dignity, courage, and balance, and that my life would finally be under my own control. The day dawned radiant, reflecting the feeling of renewal I felt inside. For the first time in a long time, anxiety and fear had given way to confidence and serenity. Every step, every decision I had made in recent days had prepared me for this moment. Finally, I was ready to end a cycle of pain, humiliation, and contempt, and assume my place of dignity and respect. In the morning, I organized the final documents that would prove my legal and emotional standing. Each paper, each receipt, and each piece of evidence was a part that transformed years of suffering into a story of overcoming adversity. I felt a silent emotion realizing that everything I had faced had not been in vain. My patience, observation, and faith had been the foundation for the victory that was now approaching. I decided to go to my daughter and son-in-law's house in person. My posture was firm but calm. There was no anger in my eyes, only determination and the certainty that the cycle would finally end fairly. Upon arriving, my son-in-law greeted me with his usual air of arrogance, but I perceived hesitation in his gaze. My daughter, although still showing some indifference, could no longer ignore the change that was occurring within me. I handed them a copy of the evidence and explained my claims clearly and objectively. There were no shouts, accusations, or confrontations. Every word conveyed firmness and serenity. The impact was immediate. The son-in-law's arrogance began to waver, and my daughter showed signs of surprise and reflection. For the first time, they were not in control of the situation, and I didn't need approval to assert my dignity. During the conversation, I shared not only the documents, but also my experiences, feelings, and transformations. I explained how each act of humiliation, each contemptuous comment, and each challenge faced had strengthened me. The emotion in my voice, the sincerity of each word, and the firmness of my posture created an unexpected effect. My daughter began to see not only the justice I sought, but also the person I had become. My son-in-law, in turn, remained silent for long minutes, visibly shaken. For the first time, I realized that his power over me had crumbled. Every controlling strategy, every arrogant gesture, had been neutralized by my knowledge, patience, and quiet strength. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The inner transformation had already been enough to change the family dynamic. After the conversation, I noticed a small gesture from my daughter. She held my hand, albeit hesitantly, and said something simple, yet full of meaning. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know how wrong I was." That phrase, even timid, carried immense emotional weight. For the first time, I felt that reconciliation, even if initial, was possible. Respect was beginning to be restored, and the pain of the past was finding a path to healing. As I left the house, I felt a profound emotion. The emotional justice I had sought for so long was not merely a legal or material victory. It was a victory of dignity, patience, and the quiet strength I had always carried. Every tear, every act of humiliation, and every challenge faced had served to prepare for this moment. For the first time, I felt that my life truly belonged to me, and that my story was being written by me, not by others. Back in my apartment, I sat by the window, watching the sky tinged with the last rays of sunlight. The feeling of peace was indescribable. For the first time, I realized that overcoming challenges isn't just about beating others, but about overcoming one's own pain, fears, and limitations. My life was finally in balance. The contempt, arrogance, and humiliation had been transformed into learning, strength, and wisdom. At that moment, I felt a silent gratitude. Every challenge, every humiliation, and every gesture of contempt had been fundamental in shaping the woman I had become. I knew there would still be difficult days, but I also knew that my strength, dignity, and faith would be enough to face any situation. For the first time, I felt that justice is not just something to be waited for, but something to be achieved through patience, strategy, and courage. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I reflected on the entire journey. The weight of the past had transformed into a life lesson. The pain, the humiliation, and the contempt had been tools for learning and strengthening. For the first time, I felt that my story was not defined by the mistakes or cruelty of others, but by how I chose to face each challenge and remain firm in my principles. And before closing my eyes, I realized something powerful. The inner transformation that had begun in the most painful moments was now becoming visible in my external life. My dignity, courage, and faith not only liberated me, but also influenced the perception of those who had previously despised me. For the first time, I felt that emotional justice, overcoming adversity, and reconciliation were possible realities, and that my life was finally complete in balance, respect, and self-love. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a profound sense of victory. For the first time, I realized I had fulfilled my purpose: to transform pain into learning, humiliation into strength, and contempt into justice. Every moment lived, every tear shed, and every gesture of patience and observation had paved the way for this outcome. I was no longer a victim. I was the protagonist of my own story, with dignity, courage, and faith. And that night, I felt that nothing and no one could take away my peace. The victory wasn't just about material justice or family recognition. It was the victory of dignity, of silent faith, and of the inner strength I had cultivated. For the first time, I realized that my story had been rewritten, not by the mistakes of others, but by my ability to overcome, resist, and transform pain into fulfillment.